Florida this week. Well, this is Radioactivity on WMNF in Tampa. I'm Rob Lorai. Dr. Jill Stein, who is seeking the Green Party presidential nomination, called last week upon Congress to stand up to terrorists by rejecting the Obama administration's proposed sale of $1.3 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia. Congress has 30 days to reject the deal. Now it's got even less time than that. And we're joined now by Dr. Jill Stein, who is seeking the Green Party nomination for president. And Jill Stein, welcome back to WMNF. Good to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Rob. Thank you so much.
Well, let me ask you about this weapon sale. Why are you opposed to selling weapons to Saudi Arabia?
Well, you know, we're sort of doing the push and the pull at the same time. With one hand, we claim to be fighting terrorism, and, you know, we've thrown $6 trillion into fighting this global war on terror over the past 14 years. We've killed over 1 million people in Iraq alone, most of them innocent civilians, and that doesn't even include the 500,000 children killed as part of the economic embargo before that, and tens of thousands of American soldiers have been either killed or maimed in the process. What more exactly are we going to throw into this militarily to win this conflict? We have to do this other ways. But let me say, while we are pushing to fight terrorism through these wars and by arming our supposed allies, we are at the same time basically supporting and selling weapons to the terrorists and those who are arming and funding the terrorists. And Saudi Arabia is undoubtedly the number one, notorious actor here in terms of funding and arming and inspiring terrorism from its early origins with the Mujahideen back in the 1960s and 70s in Afghanistan. So it's just incredible that we are basically arming the terrorists by selling these weapons to Saudi Arabia. Those weapons are coming back to fight us directly on the battlefield. This is entirely the wrong program, the wrong paradigm, and wrong in detail. Let us start the fight against terrorism by ceasing the arming and funding of the terrorists.
Well, when you say terrorists, are you talking about ISIS?
Absolutely. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front, and allied groups, which have many names and shifting organizations. But the Saudis have been solidly behind this. In the secret cables that were disclosed by WikiLeaks several years ago, actually Secretary Clinton herself signed on to the cables identifying Saudi Arabia as the major funding source of international terrorism and jihadism.
You know, this is rarely talked about in the press. I don't know if you saw these two pieces, but Fareed Zakaria, after the Paris attacks a few days ago, did a documentary on CNN about the origins of ISIS and the funding of ISIS, and this idea that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS didn't come up in that documentary. And then PBS the other day on the NewsHour, Paul Solomon did a whole segment about the funding of ISIS, and he didn't mention Saudi Arabia. You say that in the WikiLeaks documents, Hillary Clinton is quoted as saying that the Saudi donors constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide like ISIS. Why do you think, at least in the American press, they don't bring up this idea that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS?
This gets to the heart of the problem. We do need full disclosure, and I think the American public is owed a full and fair accounting of what does our intelligence know about who is funding terrorists, who is funding and who is arming them, because they know quite a bit. And in fact, there are 28 pages of the 9/11 report, which are still redacted and unavailable to the American public. We were driven headlong into a catastrophic war, the regime change in Iraq, and then several others after that. And that war, it's widely agreed, was based on deceptive, misleading information, a.k.a. lies, we should not allow ourselves to be goaded into more catastrophe, as we stand on the precipice of another war, all-out war, perhaps World War III growing out of Syria right now. The American public deserves to know what's going on, and it is absolutely unacceptable that that we are not being told what's actually going on here. And that disclosure could begin with releasing the 28 redacted pages about what went on in 9/11.
Do you think
it goes far beyond that. It goes to even, the flow of weapons and funding right now. The New York Times had an article in 2011 or 2012, I believe. No, actually it was 2013, reporting on the prior year's worth of arms and funding to the so-called rebel opposition, to use the euphemistic term, that is 80% of which is Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and associated forces in Syria. There was a very good article in the New York Times based on original investigative reporting, which clarified that it is, in fact, Saudis, Qatar, and Turkey who are the leading actors in sending arms and in funding. Yet, as you say, this is not, it rarely surfaces in the corporate press. And, let's not be goaded into another insane war here based on false information and an absolutely catastrophic strategy that has proven itself over the last 14 years to be a disaster. It has created failed states. It has created absolutely massive humanitarian disasters in the form of mass refugee movements. And in addition, this is growing greater and greater terrorist threats. You do not fight terrorism with bombs and bullets. You have to, undermine it at its source. That includes stopping the funding, stopping the armaments, and stopping the civil wars and military violence, which creates the utter desperation and insanity that drives people into the arms of violent jihadism.
We're talking with Jill Stein. She's running for the Green Party presidential nomination, and we're talking about the U.S., proposal by President Obama to sell $1.3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Congress has about 21 days to reject the deal. Our phone number, 813-239-9663. Jill, I want to ask you, to what extent do you think that what's going on over there, whether it's the Saudi fight in Yemen or ISIS fighting in Syria, in Iraq, to what extent are we seeing now a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or a war between radical Sunni factions and Shiite factions? To what extent is that what's going on in that part of the world?
That is, that certainly appears to be a major dimension of what's going on. And there's sort of a higher order element here, which is it's the meddling of U.S. and allied powers in the West in the oil economy and in the oil resources of the region. I mean, there's a reason why the conflicts in the Middle East are armed to the teeth. There's been enormous money pouring in, since the Second World War, when the U.S. basically shored up Saudi Arabia and made a deal with the devil and said, we will safeguard whatever you want to do with Wahhabism, which was sort of, the instigator of or really the ultimate or the initial paradigm of violent jihadism. We said, we'll do that. You just keep the supply of oil going. And we've essentially greenwashed the Saudis ever since with their very violent and strange convictions and strategies. But, when you pour enormous amounts of money into a region in order to impose dictatorships, buy off democracy, suppress human rights, it's trouble every time. You can look at the same thing developing in Nigeria. In areas around the world where we have poured so much money in, struggles of democracy, have been suppressed and violently obliterated for decades. And you can look back to the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran back in what was it, the 50s?
1953, yeah.
Where we first overthrew that government and installed the Shah of Iran. This is sort of an extremely immoral and evil basis for foreign policy and economic policy, which only gets more violent and more catastrophic as we go. With each cycle of violence, it becomes worse. You can compare this to, for example, the movements of self-determination in Latin America, in Central America or South America, where there was a lot of violence for sure, but and related again to U.S. Overthrows of democratic governments, our imposition of corporate rule on Guatemala, where we wanted to be sure that United Fruit had access to land and markets, et cetera. We have repeated this cycle of violence. It became, far less catastrophic in a global sense in Latin America because there wasn't as much money pouring in as in the oil areas of the world, where this thing has totally exploded into global proportions, such that we have, just millions of refugees that are streaming out of the area, threatening to disrupt the European Union, to whom the U.S. is turning its back now, comparable to the way that Jewish refugees were sent back after sailing over to save their lives. They were turned back. The same thing is going on right now. This is really a cataclysm of human rights abuse and violence and militarism that just keeps compounding itself. We really need to dispense with that paradigm. Let's not go through another cycle of this in Syria, which is what we are being goaded into. And you can look at all of the Democratic and Republican candidates right now. They are all falling into this trap, all of them. They differ in whether they are calling for an air war, which basically a no-fly zone is. That is an air war with nuclear-armed Russia, by the way. They're calling for an air war, some of them, Hillary Clinton, or they're calling for a ground war, sending in the troops, and that's many of the Republicans. They differ in who they say should lead. So most of them say, U.S. ought to lead the charge. Bernie Sanders says, no, let the Saudis lead the charge. Donald Trump says, let the Russians lead the charge. But they have all bought into this utter disaster of a paradigm, which is just mind-boggling. Like, what's their memory retention? Is it 5 days or what? Have they forgotten where we've gotten over the past 14 years, fighting these series of escalating wars and the Afghanistan catastrophe before that, looking at what happened to, the Soviet Union, our efforts to grow violent resistance to the Soviet Union by creating the Mujahideen, or shall we say arming them and financing them, which we and the Saudis were very involved in. We got this going in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s. And with each cycle, it becomes more and more global in its reach, more and more catastrophic. It's time, to create a peace offensive. People think, if you're not fighting, you're surrendering. But that's actually not true. By fighting, you are essentially surrendering to the same chaos. What we actually have to do now is truly an effective form of fighting this. We need a weapons embargo to the Middle East. We need to impound the bank accounts, freeze and then seize, if need be, the bank accounts of those who are funding these terrorist movements and arming them. So there are real tools that can be used here, but they require the United States to actually do the right thing and not to continue this deal with the devil, Saudi Arabia, and others from whom we've been procuring oil. This ties in, if I can just make one last comment, to the need to come clean ourselves. We need a green economy. That's why, we're calling for a Green New Deal that is an emergency plan to move to 100% clean renewable energy by 2030, and in the process create the jobs we need to revive our economy, and in the process make these wars for oil obsolete. We have to do the right thing by the climate, by means of economic and social justice, and by means of ending these ever-escalating wars on terror.
We're talking with Jill Stein, who's running for the Green Party nomination for president. Why do you, Jill, why do you think President Obama has not spoken out negatively about the Saudi role in all of this? Why does he not mention Saudi Arabia?
I'm afraid he is as bought into this, he's drunk the Kool-Aid as much as anybody. This latest $1.5 billion arms sale is, $1.3 billion approximately in proposed bombs that we want to sell to the human rights abuser and war criminal Saudi Arabia. That is a drop in the bucket of what's gone on over the last 5 years, which is actually $100 billion worth of arms sales. So if anybody has any questions about where the arms are coming from all over the Middle East, we are supplying them to Saudi Arabia, who in turn is distributing them to whomever they want. And, Barack Obama, regrettably, he'll say one thing, but at the end of the day, what he does is quite another. And he has been, from the get-go, the creature of the big banks and the fossil fuel companies and the war manufacturers. So occasionally he says the right thing, and he is saying a few of the right things right now in some ways, but he's not doing the right thing. And this is what we've come to expect from the general misleadership of the U.S. of A.
Well, Dr. Jill Stein is calling for Congress to stop the proposed sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. It's $1.3 billion. Among the things, 10,000 advanced air-to-surface munitions like laser-guided bombs and bunker-buster bombs. That's a part of the deal. Jill, I've got every line lit, but I want to ask you about the attack on Planned Parenthood in Colorado Springs on Friday night. What was your take on that? Jill,
this is tragic. It's tragic. It's horrific. And again, there has been a lot of loose hate speech out there among the political misleaders as others, and that hate speech needs to be reined in with regard to, women's right to choose, with regard to reproductive health care, with regard to immigrants. It's a very sad reflection on the state of dialogue in Washington, D.C., that it is fanning the flames of madness and violence out in the streets.
Well, reined in, what do you mean reined in? I mean, are you calling on those folks to stop it, the people that put out the Planned Parenthood videos, or what do you mean reined in?
Yes. I was referring specifically to candidates who are talking about the sale of body parts, the sale of infant body parts, which is how medical research is being mischaracterized here. And there has been a highly politicized demagoguery taking place. Demagoguery, an effort to exploit issues of women's reproductive rights and even medical research to exploit them for political ends. And there have been several of the Republican presidential candidates who have been using that language in an effort to galvanize their base. But I think the campaign itself that sought to politicize and mischaracterize medical research, I think is really inexcusable and shares some of the culpability here.
Well, Dr. Stein, we've got about 5 minutes left in the show. I've got every line lit. Can you take a phone call or two from a listener?
Sure, I'd love to.
All right, we're talking with Dr. Jill Stein, who is running for the Green Party presidential nomination. And let's go to George, who's in Tampa. George, thanks for calling. What's your question for Dr. Stein? George? Did he drop off? Okay, let's go to John in Largo. John, you're on with Dr. Stein. What would you like to ask her?
Hi, Dr. Stein. Your views are very refreshing on that. The silence is so deafening on the media about this. It's terrible. You know what I mean? But a quick question. Any comments on Netanyahu, his seeming indifference toward ISIS? I mean, I've heard Israeli officials even comment that ISIS shouldn't be that much of a concern and that Iran should be more of a concern.
Yeah. This is, what we've come to expect from the Israeli misleadership. And, I personally don't put a lot of stock in what Netanyahu says. And in my view, he himself is one of the violators, massive violators of human rights and international law, from whom funding should also be withdrawn. Because the U.S. is now funding basically the massacre of Palestinians every couple of years by Israeli wars. They really can't even be called wars because there's hardly a fight back. I think these have to be considered human rights disasters, violations of international law, and war crimes. The U.S. should not be in the business of funding them either, to the tune of $8 million a day.
Great.
All right. John, thank you. Thank you for your call. Let's go to Abdullah. Abdullah, thank you for calling, and I see that you're in Largo. Abdullah, what's your question?
Well, the question is, she say about Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar, this for ISIS. How come the ISIS attacked Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and never attacked Iran and Israel?
Okay, so you're making the point that ISIS attacks Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and doesn't attack Israel.
And there isn't no ISIS in Israel or Iran. There is ISIS in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. As a matter of fact, today, 3 soldiers killed from the Saudi fighting these ISIS. And we never heard any bomb or any attack or any ISIS in Iran and Saudi Arabia. And she believes that ISIS is in support by Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar. How come?
Okay. Abdullah, thanks. Thanks for your call. What would you say, Jill?
If I understood correctly, what Abdullah was saying was that we're not seeing ISIS in Israel and Iran, did he say? And he was asking why not?
Yeah.
And, I'd say that's very interesting. And, in part, ISIS seems to be going after those who are most visibly attacking it, and that appeared to be the provocation for taking down the Russian passenger jet. So, one response to that might be that, ISIS is going after, ISIS is doing revenge attacks, one would assume. But, are there bigger underlying issues as well? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Dr. Stein, before we let you go, I want to ask you on something entirely different, and that is, what do you think of Donald Trump running for the Republican nomination for president?
Donald Trump is kind of the poster child of the Republican Party, whether they like it or not. He's a little bit outside of the mainstream on some issues. He thinks the Russians should carry the water against ISIS and the U.S. should not. He supports single-payer health care, or so he says. But, this is a guy who's running on the billions of dollars that he has made through shady deals and, the exercise of corporate privilege. And he is certainly as out of touch as any oligarch can be. And his hate speech, I think, is very dangerous. And I think he's sort of a poster child of how the political process, not just Republicans, Democrats as well, but he's kind of, the tip of the iceberg, how it's become absolutely unhinged. And it does not correspond to reality or to people's needs. And this is a guy who doesn't even need to beg for funding from billionaires and hedge fund managers and kingpins of the fossil fuel industry. He just funds himself, and he's a totally loose cannon. He fans the flames of hatred and violence, and he's a very dangerous person, and it speaks volumes about the American political system that he is become a spokesperson for it. Remember, according to a recent Wall Street Journal poll, 50% of Americans now do not identify as either Democrats or Republicans. 21% identify as Republicans, 29% identify as Democrats. Donald Trump has the support of about 30% of Republicans. 30% of 21% is 7%. You know, our political system is really speaking to the lunatic fringe right now.
All right. And
it's important we go around it. I encourage people to go to my website, jill2016.com.
All right.
And
Dr.
let's
Jill,
see the force.
Dr. Jill Stein, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. Take care.
All right. Good
Bye-bye.
to talk to you. Sean will be talking about Donald